Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Phenomenon, a paranormal podcast. I'm Christina.
And this is Anthony. How's everyone doing today?
Well, we've got a doozy today for this episode.
Yeah, for sure. We're taking an interesting topic, something that is not necessarily a specific case, but more of a broad subject, kind of an urban legend meets myth, I guess you would call it.
Meets science, I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting because there's more weight to this legend than most.
Yeah, this is something that is widely experienced.
Yeah.
So, without further drawing this out, we're going to be talking today about the Hat Man.
Yeah, a lot of people, if you are a paranormal enthusiast, you know this story well. But the Hat Man is an interesting figure that appears to a lot of people, not just in one area, but around the world, throughout various cultures and cities and towns. I mean, this is a widely experienced phenomena.
This. Let's go to the beginning, which I guess
Yeah.
I had a lot of questions. I put out a post in the paranormal community in preparation for this podcast.
Right.
And I guess, there were people who were very, very familiar and had so many stories. And honestly, the responses to that post keep coming in as I sit here.
It's one of our more popular posts that we've put out there to the community. A lot of people seem to have stories to tell about this entity. And we, have been listening to everyone's stories, and it's interesting to see how many similarities there are across the spectrum. It's not just everyone has their own story with different events occurring. It's very similar experiences.
Exactly. And on the other side of the spectrum are the people who weren't familiar, who wanted to know what the Hat Man is. And this is where it gets kind of interesting.
Yeah, especially because we're living in a day and age where, especially with the internet, legends can be born from stories told online. And of course, one of the more popular ones is Slender Man.
Right.
You always have to be careful when you're investigating cases like this, even though there is the theory that you can create these legends with sheer belief. A lot of people claim that things like Slender Man or the Rake or something can be manifested if enough people believe in it, and their fear and their anxiety kind of feeds into it. It can manifest.
Right.
However, they themselves, the Slender Man, the Rake, are not real entities that existed before these stories did.
Exactly.
However, the Hat Man is much different, as our research shows.
Yes, this goes back. Well, where I was trying to go is that it's a type of, or some people believe it's a type of shadow person. Mm-hmm. If you're familiar with this, expression, if you're at all involved in the paranormal, then shadow people are just what they sound like. They are, you often will have it expressed as people capturing a glimpse out of the corner of their eye or down a hallway of a shadow in the shape of a person.
Yeah, it's a humanoid shaped form.
Exactly.
It's not like a creature per se. It's a person, or at least it's shaped like a person, but it's their shadow. It's not like you can see definitive features on them or anything. It's just a shadow.
And they're usually gone fairly quickly, as quickly as they come. There's speculation as to, is this another form of a spirit or ghost? Is it something else? Entirely different kind of entity?
There are a lot of different theories on it. Most tend to believe it is spirit related or ghost. But there are also the people who claim that it could be demonic.
Right.
Or some sort of creature. There's a lot of theories you can go with here, but the interesting thing about the Hat Man is there's even more speculation about him than most shadow figures.
Exactly. He sort of it takes top billing in that department.
Almost as if he's in charge, which is interesting because that's one of the theories, but we'll get into that later.
Exactly. So in trying to find ways to explain to people what the Hat Man is, you start really discovering just all the various different theories as to, what he can be. And, what the most common thing I think is people referring to him being a form of a shadow person.
Right.
And that, then you kind of dive in further, and it's how is he different than them if he's a type of shadow person, right?
Yeah, but there's a big difference between him and the typical shadow person. Shadow person, as Christina pointed out, typically they're seen out of the corner of your eye, or if you do get a glimpse of them, they move very fast. They're not stationary, they're always on the move. However, the Hat Man is much different because he seems to have, for the most part, a tendency of watching people.
Right.
And a lot of people will report this when they're asleep and then they wake up. Some experience sleep paralysis, others are wide awake, and in our research we've even seen some occurrences in the daytime.
Right.
So it's interesting to see this isn't strictly towards people who are asleep. However, a lot of the cases we did research, it was at night.
Early morning hours.
Early morning, they're in bed, and they look up from their bed, and usually in the corner of their room or in a closet of some sort, they see this shadow man. And what makes him unique is that it's not just the outline of a man. It's a definitive outline of a large, trench coat,
right, and
a wide-brimmed hat.
And the hats can vary.
That's the interesting thing about him.
Yeah, I think that's what makes him pretty intriguing, is that, it goes from a big wide-brimmed fedora to a cowboy hat, in some cases, a dark picture Clint Eastwood, old Western days black hat, or it can go to an actual top hat.
Right.
Or detectives type hat, but always a hat.
Yeah, the hats is the key difference for him.
Now, I will say here, something interesting that came up in all the posts last night was there also are people who see the same type of lurking shadow figure dressed as an old monk.
Right, that's interesting.
With a hooded type monk figure.
Yeah.
That's another variation of this.
He's always described with old-fashioned clothing, whether it's the monk outfit, a trench coat, or some have even said he has a cape.
Right.
Which is interesting. He's at least 6 feet tall. Some people have reported him to be 8 feet tall, or as tall as the ceiling of their home.
Right.
Which is unique. That's a big difference for shadow people as well. A lot of shadow people are either normal height, or they are small children,
right,
or even tiny little figures,
right,
which I'll get into later with a personal story. But that's the shadow people is typically that. But this shadow man, this Hat Man, is extremely tall, kind of overbearing, especially when you're in that situation when you're in bed, you're in the comfort of your own home, and then you see this tall, overpowering figure.
Right.
And instead of it disappearing right away or running away, he is watching you, and he starts moving closer to you.
Oh, yeah, that is very common.
He slowly starts walking towards you, but the interesting thing is people know he doesn't walk like a normal person. He glides. And he's supposed to be gliding kind of like a foot off the ground. And one of the interesting things about him, too, is that some people, not everyone, but some people have reported him had to have red glowing eyes. Or even the eyes of, if a light bulb were to go off.
Right.
Those are his eyes. They're piercing eyes. But yet you can't see any other features of his face. That's what makes him in the classification of a shadow person.
Right. Now, I think that his presence of lurking, watching, inching towards you, rather than other reports of shadows that people will see darting away, as almost as if they were more in fear of the humans in the situation. That is what really makes the Hat Man experience different, because
he doesn't seem afraid.
No, in fact, I think that's what creates the fear.
Mm-hmm.
And one could argue whether or not he knows he's generating that fear in doing that, and that's because some people think he feeds off fear. But imagine seeing this ominous presence.
There's even a group of people I've read that claim that they've seen him with a gold watch attached to a chain on his belt, and as he's moving towards you, they'll see this figure, the Hat Man, pick up the gold watch and look at the time.
Huh.
As if he's on a schedule of some sort.
Right.
Or he's expected somewhere.
or he needs a certain amount of fear,
Right.
and he's keeping track. I mean, that's an interesting thing. I haven't read that one myself, so that's really interesting.
Well, we definitely, our goal is to kind of present the paranormal as something not to be afraid of.
Right.
What is interesting about this, whether it's related or not, we don't know, but this Hat Man tends to appear during times of stress, of negative energy building up within a person's home or the area that they're around. So usually a person is in some sort of turmoil.
Right.
Whether there's fighting in a home, or someone lost a loved one, or there's an illness of some sort. Stuff like that tend to bring about the appearances of this Hat Man. Now, whether he's causing it or he just is drawn to it, who knows?
Well, we talked about the fact that, this is something that is known in the paranormal field, but when it comes to certain types of activity, such as poltergeist activity, let's say, that it often does seem to center around teenagers.
Right.
Often in the poltergeist situation, teenage girls. But I don't know if the consensus on that is that, teenage years can be full of turmoil.
Right.
And a lot of situations that arise during that time, and that's what sort of generates this negative energy that allows a poltergeist to manifest. So I think the theory here too is very much the same, that if, because I did speak to, someone in particular last night who had this experience with the Hat Man several times during his teenage years.
Right.
And that he was going through a lot of different things, when it came to problems at school, problems at home, problems with depression,
Right.
all at that time frame, and that this is when this started happening. So is that sort of negative emotion that happens during that time or during struggles something that can help negative energy sort of feed on and manifest and create these things?
Right. Something I think, isn't always talked about in the paranormal is that the presence of a spirit, whether or not the Hat Man is a spirit or not, that's debatable, of course. Everyone has their theory. But spirits are supposed to be the essence of a person,
right,
that lived. At least that's the ongoing theory. Well, people are flawed.
Sure.
And they're flawed in life, and not everyone in life is a good person. So there isn't anything to say that when you're interacting with a spirit or an entity that they will always be truthful, or that there will always be a positive influence
right.
on an investigation. There are going to be negative spirits. I don't necessarily think that means that they're malicious or going to attack you. It just
right.
means they're not a positive influence.
Exactly. Well, I mean, we've talked about this before as far as in communicating with spirits.
Right.
That, we believe that energy is what is left behind, not necessarily a soul
right.
but actual energy into like this quantum consciousness
right.
scenario. So, and in the same token, if someone was a negative person in life,
right.
That energy that is left behind is going to be negative, and they're going to respond the same way. So, I think you have to consider all of that in this scenario of the Hat Man. If it is about negative energy that manifests because of negative things going on around you,
right.
it's put out into the universe, I mean, that theory could hold some weight.
There's a lot of interesting things that kind of lend credence to that negative influence, because while there's most of the cases that I've read involve him just being a watcher, just watching.
Right.
There are the odd occurrences of people who claim that this Hat Man has jumped on them, or choked them, or people have experienced a burning in their chest or a tingling on their scalp.
But this brings me to the whole sleep paralysis theory.
Yeah, that's kind of what I lean towards in those cases, especially.
Right, because everything that they're describing, which is why, there are a lot of people who think the Hat Man is just that. It's just a derivative, form of the experience of sleep paralysis, where people often describe seeing a demon type figure at the end of their bed,
right,
or starting in the corner and coming toward them and ending up sitting on their chest. They can't move, and they, often feel that sort of feeling of, like you're having a heart attack. You have all this pressure on your chest,
right,
and there's nothing you can do about it. You're literally paralyzed.
right.
So this whole thing with the Hat Man has some similarities in that regard.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things that I was getting were interesting to me last night too in these comments on the post. There were several people who commented that this happened to them when they had sleep paralysis, that what they did see was not necessarily a demonic type figure, but that they saw the Hat Man.
Right.
Other people didn't necessarily have sleep paralysis, but they had a history of nightmares. There were people who were sleepwalkers.
Night terrors.
Night terrors. I mean, this whole factor surrounding sleep
Right.
seemed to really be very common
Right.
in this experience. So is there weight to the fact that some scientists think that this is simply because of sleep disorders?
Yeah.
Or is that just that, and this is the other side of that coin that was mentioned actually on Gaia TV,
Right.
was that it may not necessarily be that it is just that, but that maybe people with those disorders, their brain waves at those moments when they're having these issues in their sleep, does that open their brain up to being more susceptible to these experiences of the Hat Man or a demon or what have you?
I mean, for all we know, the Hat Man or whatever he is could be around all the time, or shadow people in general, and we just never can see them.
Right.
But like Christina was saying, if you're in that state of, kind of in between awake and sleep, maybe your brain is on a different level. Maybe it's on a different frequency of sorts, and you're picking up things that normally you wouldn't be able to.
Well, I don't think people take into account, because most people aren't scientists, but take into account how much our brain is responsible for,
Right.
and the kind of work that it does on just a regular basis, let alone when we're sleeping, the regular cycles that we go through when we sleep. If those patterns aren't constant and, or should I say consistent and balanced, how much that can affect us.
Right.
Just like people with insomnia, they also have been known to be more susceptible to certain things like nightmares or sleepwalking even when they do sleep, or things like this, like having sleep paralysis, because sleep deprivation can wear on you like nothing else.
Right.
And our brains are nothing but a mechanical machine that keeps us going, that literally tells us what to do every step of the way.
Oh, I've read so many theories on the brain and what it's capable of. There's so many scientists out there, and again, this is all theory. It's still stuff that is going to take a long time to test. But the leading theory and understanding of the brain is that it's not necessarily the brain can only use 10% of a certain part of the brain. It's that each part of your brain requires all of the energy you have. And so it can't use every part of your brain at once. It has to move in between each sector of your brain to be able to be used. So the leading theories are that if we were able to tap into more than one area at a time, even if you were able to open up your mind 100%, that our minds would allow us and our bodies to be capable of so much more than they actually are.
Right.
And I'm not saying necessarily you're going to become, the Hulk or something and, become a superhero. Just that you're going to have a better understanding of things around you in the world and the universe as a whole.
Exactly.
Maybe you're opening your brain up that way will allow you to see these entities far more frequently than you could possibly ever before.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because really, we have talked about this a lot.
Right.
But I've always had my theories on people with mental health issues
Correct.
being more open in a lot of cases, or often misdiagnosed.
Right.
The idea of auditory and visual hallucinations. Not that it's not a real thing that happens to people with certain mental disorders.
Right.
But I also think that if everybody who was an empath, let's say,
Right.
who, you talk about being sensitive to being able to hear and see spirits, where some people can't see them at all, but some people who might be more open mentally from that standpoint of brain chemistry and all of the things we're discussing, if everybody who experienced that came forward and talked about it openly, how many more people would be diagnosed with mental illness
Right.
that wouldn't have before, because they think automatically, well, if someone's saying that they can see things that no one else is seeing, it must be a visual hallucination.
Of course.
Or if they hear something, which in our field we might think of as an EVP,
Right.
they must be having auditory hallucinations, right? So think about it, in these cases with people who their whole life claim that they've seen the Hat Man at various points.
Right.
Are they more open for one reason or another? Are they empathic? Are they sensitive?
I'm not saying that every single person who suffers from a mental illness is not seeing something that's not there.
Right.
What I'm saying, and Christina is trying to imply, is that maybe these quote-unquote illnesses are a way of a person being more open to the world around them than others.
Right.
I think, like Christina was implying, that scientists and doctors especially have admitted that although they know some aspects of mental health in the brain, they don't know enough to be able to help people these days. That's why there's such a big push for mental health awareness, is because that there needs to be more research and studies done into this aspect of a person's mind. The mind is the most complex machine in the world.
Absolutely. And no two minds are wired exactly the same.
No, everyone's mind is wired differently.
We would be robots if that weren't true. So just like, when you talk about people with, say, schizophrenia, and they have, different brain chemistry than other people, and that's why, their wiring, their electric wiring in their brain functions completely differently than people without schizophrenia.
Right.
You have to sit there and really take yourself out of this judgmental equation where you say, okay, I understand everything about everything, and this is this and that is that. I think you have to be able to say, well, I don't think anyone could possibly fully understand how our brains work, or else we'd be much further along than we are in treatments and things like that. So
I think I've always said there's a middle ground between the people who just don't believe in anything that science can't explain right away,
right,
and the people who just do everything based off faith. I think that there is a middle ground, and while Christina and I are definitely leaning more towards science, I think that we have an understanding that there are things in the universe happening right now that science hasn't caught up to.
Right.
The science exists, it just hasn't been discovered yet. We haven't created the technology to be able to understand things happening, which including ghosts and spirits and
and
UFOs.
A belief in a scientific approach does not mean disbelief in the paranormal.
No,
I think actually it bolsters it if you really look at it. But that's a whole nother story. And I know we got off track a little bit, but the thing is, when it comes to these experiences with the Hat Man, I mean, I just think that there is a lot of too much consistency in people's stories.
Right.
To just write it off as simple sleep paralysis, which I know that's a kind of an oxymoron, but something that is just easily explained away. I think it's more than that. Not that it can't be part of it.
No, of course not. Like we said, the reason we got so off topic is because we want everyone to have a full understanding of the subject. We like to present every aspect of a case and a story so that every one of you can make up your own minds about it. We want you guys to be able to see the whole picture and not just one side of it.
Exactly.
So that's why we say that there are probably a lot of cases where sleep paralysis is the cause of some of these things, or a person's mental health or what have you, but we don't think it should be written off as just that for every single person in the world.
Right. It can play a role without it being the explanation, in other words.
Of course.
And it's just like anything else. I mean, something else that I wanted to bring up about the Hat Man, being fair to everybody, obviously, even if it's not necessarily our belief system, but there, are also the people who fully believe this is an evil entity.
Of course.
Could possibly be demonic.
Yeah.
That does nothing but come there to, wish you harm, to do harm.
Some even say to drag you to hell.
Exactly. And one of those things that ties into that is that there are people who have played with Ouija boards, who claim that the Hat Man came through after they had played with the Ouija board and maybe didn't close it properly, or didn't know what they were doing.
And there's a lot of different theories on the Ouija board, of course. Everyone has their own opinion.
Right.
Whether or not it's the board itself or the person's, energy being put out that draws it in, or if it is real at all.
Right.
Everyone, like we said, it's up to you guys to make up your own minds about it. There's some interesting stories, though, about the Hat Man that kind of, you have to keep an open mind about things. Well, again, everyone's beliefs are different, and we respect everyone's beliefs. But there's a couple of stories I was reading about here that are interesting that kind of make some people lean towards the demonic side of things.
Right.
There's a woman named Heidi Hollis who has a story of a German soldier that she met who told her about witnessing the Hat Man. And he was actually able to speak, so he claims, to the Hat Man. And he asked him who he was. And the only thing that the Hat Man said in response was that his name was Scratch. Now, if you don't know, one of the old nicknames for the devil himself in lore is Scratch, or Old Scratch. There's another story, too. And this is the same woman, Heidi Hollis, had recounted the story of a man who, unfortunately, had been suicidal. He woke up to find himself in the hospital after surviving it. And the Hat Man was close by. And according to this man, the Hat Man quickly disappeared after he was spotted, but before he did, he actually heard the Hat Man speak. And the thing that he heard the Hat Man say before disappearing was, "I almost had you." As if he was waiting to take this man after his attempt and it failed.
Right.
And because it failed and he survived, the Hat Man said he almost had him, but he didn't quite have him yet.
Right.
That's the kind of story, and there's many more stories like that kind of make people assume or believe that the Hat Man is a purely evil entity.
Exactly.
Or at least is drawn to negativity and becomes evil as it goes on, or maybe feeds off of that energy. Who knows?
I mean, it's hard because if you are looking at evil and you're looking at demons, that takes on a whole religious connotation.
Of course.
And, I know that their, belief in that sort of thing in demons is very widespread.
Of course.
So, even when we're talking about stories, there's even a popular YouTuber that we have watched.
Right.
And, he is very, very firm in his belief that he has been followed pretty much his whole life by the Hat Man.
Right. He claims, because he used to play with Ouija boards
right.
as a teenager and played with them most of his teenage years, that as a result of using these Ouija boards for so long, that this person that he calls the Shadow Man, he doesn't necessarily say it's the Hat Man, he calls him the Shadow Man.
Well, I think later on in this past year, when they actually were doing a totally different investigation, and then he was seen again, the idea of the hat came into play, if I'm not mistaken.
He started to suddenly recount details that he didn't really necessarily share on his channel before.
Right.
About seeing the hat and the coat.
Right. Well, and this brings up what I was going to say about it too, is that there is this belief that they can stick around a certain family for generations. Right. And I mention this because there was this incident with this YouTuber that while he was out on this other investigation, that he got a call or text from his younger brother,
right,
who had just had an experience of witnessing the same thing.
The Shadow Man.
The Shadow Man while he was gone. So, that is something that came up in the research into this podcast, is the idea that, some people believe that they stick with the same family for multiple generations.
Yeah, there's a lot of reports of that actually in the same family.
Exactly. So why that would be, I don't know. Is that something that is, I don't know, transmitted to other family members down the road just from hearing stories?
Right.
Or is this something that is a real experience? It's all of this stuff is very subjective, and
especially when because like we said at the beginning, you always have to be looking at this from a skeptical standpoint until you find enough research. And I wanted, when I started researching the subject, to make sure this was not another case of the Slender Man or the Rake.
Right.
So I wanted to look up the origins Now, shadow people have been seen throughout all of history. This shadow people are not necessarily a new thing.
No, that goes back centuries.
However, it was not widely known because, of course, the internet and everything wasn't a factor for throughout history.
Yeah,
so,
it's, even in the early days of the internet, it's not like it is today, where literally at any moment of the day, something that you want to know about is easily searchable.
No.
And you're able to get a wealth of information very easily.
Right, of course. So 2001 was actually the year that mainstream media started talking about shadow people, and it became what it is today, so well known and popular.
Right, very common.
It was because of an episode of the very popular show Coast to Coast AM, a radio station. After the broadcast, which talked about shadow people, many people started sending in drawings of what they had seen and shared stories of their own experiences with shadow people in general to not only that show, but to paranormal researchers all around the world. Well, there is an author for the paranormal who specifically researched strange encounters in general, and her name was Heidi Hollis, same woman
Same one, right?
who talked about those two negative encounters. And in 2008, she started putting pieces together where she noticed a common theme among these drawings and photos that were being sent in of the shadow people. And she started noticing that they all seemed to be of the same man, a hat man. All these images of a hat man with a big hat and a trench coat, and even some with glowing red eyes, of course.
Right.
It started being pieced together. Now, I will say, for full discretion, there is a creepypasta story online of the Shadow Man. But in my research, I found that the stories of the Hat Man came well before creepypasta existed.
Right.
And became a thing. So this is not the creation of a creepypasta story. The creepypasta story is actually influenced by the cases that already existed.
Right.
We've had people come and tell us stories that even stem back to the 50s and 60s.
Exactly.
So this is not something created from the internet age.
No, and on Creepypasta, the site itself, there are people who do write their own variations of stories that are based off real events or real urban legends.
Right.
Well, urban legends, real or not. So, this is why, yes, you can probably find something on the Hat Man or Shadow Man on Creepypasta, but that's not necessarily its origin.
No.
So you have to do your due diligence to find all that out.
We're going to even leave a website link in the description, and we always leave our references here.
Right.
But we discovered that there's an actual website that someone put together for the Hat Man Project.
Right.
And what this is this man had experienced the Hat Man himself and decided to start collecting the stories of people who experienced it. Well, he's got a whole website with an archive of stories submitted to him from people all around the world.
Yeah.
So there's a website here, and if you have experienced the Hat Man, there's a way you can submit your story to the website as well and be included. So we'll leave that link in the description of our podcast here. But that's how many stories there are. There's an entire website dedicated to the sightings of this entity.
Well, I can relate to that after all the responses I got just in one night alone.
Right.
And they still keep going. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up is something that came out of a lot of those responses, and in our research as well, is the fact that the Hat Man himself could be a quote-unquote harbinger of doom, or of impending doom. And as well, tied into that is death himself.
Right.
And I say that there's two aspects of that here. And the first one being that the Hat Man is actually death. That he comes when somebody is about to pass away. Somebody may even be warning you of something, of your impending doom.
Right.
And especially in the case where he's just standing there watching you. There were more than one story I got last night that related to this. And one of them in particular was a nurse who worked in a nursing home.
Right.
And so, of course, you have a lot of elderly patients in a nursing home, probably a high death turnover in a nursing home.
Of course.
And there were more than one stories like this that she was able to relay, but one in particular, there was an elderly woman who, when she came in to check on her one night, was staring into the corner and was very afraid. And she asked the nurse if she could tell the man with the hat in the corner to leave because he was scaring her.
Right.
He was staring at her and scaring her.
Wow.
And, the nurse, of course, looked over, didn't see anybody. She, assured her there was no one there, but the woman was insistent that there was a man in the corner with a hat just staring at her.
Yeah.
And she tried to reassure her. And as a nurse, a lot of times with elderly patients who may, have dementia, may not, completely be there, seeing things is not uncommon.
Of course.
But this particular woman passed away just a few short days later.
Wow.
So this, of course, stuck out to her, but yet, it took more occurrences of that same type of thing happening before she has to step back and say,
yeah,
what was she really seeing in the corner? And especially people who are religious,
of course,
who can really relate to the idea that there's actually an angel of death,
right,
that will appear to you right before you're passing. That really stuck out, as a possibility.
Right.
And that was not the only report like that. You could read probably countless reports like that, on the internet where it comes to the Hat Man. But then the other side of it is the idea of him being a messenger of sorts, of some sort of impending doom, very similar to another entity that we're all very familiar with, which is the Mothman.
Yeah, that is a interesting story because it goes into another theory of the Hat Man that is not as widely, explored, that I think kind of bears more exploration and investigation. So much of the Hat Man is kind of relegated to either you're religious and you believe it's a religious aspect of your belief system, or it's just purely paranormal.
Right.
However, the interesting thing about the Hat Man is his appearance when things are about to go wrong, when something bad is about to happen. And like Christina said, this is very directly tied to the Mothman, especially when you read the infamous book by Gray Barker, who was very integral to the investigation of the Hat Man. He wrote a book about it, actually. It's called The Silver Bridge. And this ties into an interesting concept that maybe the Hat Man is not so different from the Men in Black.
Yes, the Men in Black, infamous Men in Black, which tie to not only the Mothman sightings and the whole incident of the Silver Bridge in Point Pleasant, but they extend far beyond that into the, alien UFO circles.
Right.
So I'll let you continue, but go right ahead.
Well, another book that Barker wrote was called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, and he touched more about the Men in Black specifically here, and even the cover of his original book shows 3 men in black
in shadow,
who are purely shadow, and they were wearing a trench coat and a black hat,
right,
and a wide brimmed hat at that. One of the interesting things about this is that the descriptions that Barker would later go on to distinguish about the Men in Black is they always appeared in 3 or 4. They always wore dark clothes, dark trench coats, especially with dark wide brimmed hats, and their faces were indistinguishable. Their features were never really able to be clearly defined. Some even couldn't see their faces. Only the piercing glow of their eyes.
Right.
And they always came to warn people not to speak about what they saw, what they experienced. The Mothman is one of the most famous cases you can imagine, of course.
Exactly.
Being about this because, of course, there were the 4 teenagers who initially saw this creature, the Mothman, over Point Pleasant. And then later on, you have the story of this man who saw a flying saucer while driving home from his job as a traveling salesman, and the UFO stopped right behind him as he pulled over to the side of the road, and a man appeared who said that his name was Indrid Cold.
Right.
That's the infamous story of the Mothman, and of course, several reports would come out from people in the same area of Point Pleasant about seeing the Mothman, about seeing strange things. There's an uptick of paranormal activity, of ghosts, and of course UFOs, until, of course, the tragedy of the Silver Bridge collapse.
Right.
Which the bridge collapsed and several people died, and it was a tragedy. and then the cases kind of stopped. But there were a lot of people who claimed that they saw this Mothman in the skies, even on the bridge itself, right before it collapsed.
And so the theory behind that being that his appearance there was not necessarily one of fear and intimidation, but one of trying to warn people for this impending tragedy that was going to happen.
Right.
You know, and of course, there's no way to prove that that was the intention.
Right.
But I guess that's you could surmise that by all of what followed and the fact that, you know, it wasn't as if the sightings ever, you know, explained like a true attack on people, so to speak.
Right.
But more of a presence. And then, you know, the being sighted on the bridge and so forth. You know, the movie definitely fictionalizes some things. If you've seen the movie, The Mothman Prophecies.
Right, of course.
But, you know, that was based in a lot of truth. And what they didn't touch on as much in the movie, which happened more so in reality, are the number of increasing UFO sightings leading up to everything. And the presence of the Men in Black.
Of course. And there's an interesting thing about this because Gray Barker is the one who kind of introduced the Men in Black as a wider concept along with John Keel. However, in 1953, there is a young UFO enthusiast who described the Men in Black in greater detail that kind of ties into why the Hat Man is connected to this. His name was Albert K. Bender. He wrote a book, let me find it here, in 1962 called Flying Saucers and the Three Men. And in this book, he described the Men in Black in much more frightening detail. He said that they floated about a foot off the floor. He also said they looked like clergymen,
really?
Which was interesting because of the Hat Man sometimes appearing as if he was
a monk.
A monk.
Right.
They wore hats similar to Homburg style. The faces were not clearly discernible, for the hats partly hid and shaded them, as if in shadow.
Right.
And the eyes of all three figures suddenly lit up like a flashlight bulbs. They seemed to burn into his very soul, as he described it, as the pains above his eyes became almost unbearable. So he was getting pain, actual physical pain in his eyes upon these three men approaching him.
Right.
Now, what's interesting about that is the similar description of the three men to what the Hat Man is. And also the other thing about the Men in Black is they often tend to be observers. They tend to be going to places where incidents are occurring. And the thing about the UFO aspect of it is so many people who experience the UFO phenomenon are terrified in those moments. And it's understandable. You're seeing something that defies logic and you're scared. You're terrified. Your fear is a natural response to things you don't understand, of course.
Of course.
So that occurs, and then these Men in Black show up and approach you and tell you not to talk about these things, but you can't distinguish their features. You're hearing what they're saying, but yet they're almost like they're not fully there.
Right.
And they're floating off the ground, which is an interesting thing that he noted. So that kind of ties into what people are reporting about this Hat Man. They're very similar descriptions, and there have even been people who say they saw the Hat Man specifically, who said that he appeared as right before they were abducted by a UFO.
Yeah, I was going to mention that one. I mean, that's what's interesting to tie all this into one little nice, neat bow is wherever there is paranormal activity, you know, a lot of times what people don't realize is that similar activity is going on, for instance, a haunting, paranormal activity, Bigfoot sightings, UFO sightings. These seem to happen in pockets.
Yeah.
And someone's comment to me in last night's thread had to do with portals.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept right there.
You know, we have talked about this before with all of these sightings, these different types of sightings in the paranormal field, with, you know, places where the veil between, let's say, our reality and another reality, or dimensions, our dimension, another dimension, parallel universes, where a veil is thinner, and there could be a quote-unquote portal.
Even time itself.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's a whole...
I'm just throwing that out there. I mean, no one knows.
Last week's episode. Time
I know, right? I mean, the point is no one knows what these portals are. It's just the fact that there is some sort of thinness between some sort of barrier in our reality.
Right.
I mean, whether it's time, whether it's universes, who knows? But strange things occur.
Of course.
In these pockets, these portals.
In clusters, no doubt. And these things can happen in various areas, and they, in the areas where they have a high incidence of Bigfoot sightings, they also have a high incidence of UFO sightings.
Right.
And then you'll find little stories interspersed around those same areas of spirit activity.
Right.
So there is this idea, and the Hat Man now plays into this,
right,
that maybe they are interdimensional beings of
right.
some sort. And by that I mean, much like in the case of the Bigfoot sightings,
the Yucca Man,
which
you guys love. You guys love that episode.
Exactly. That Bigfoot researchers will tell you, the majority of them believe that they are interdimensional beings that can, they've never been caught. There's never been an actual Bigfoot brought, after being captured or killed, brought into the public eye.
There's nothing but grainy film and photograph footage.
Exactly. And now you can say, well, why? If they're real, why not? Well, if you believe that they could be real, then what is your theory there if not you've never been able to fully capture one or even get good verifiable evidence of a Bigfoot?
You'd think if they were just an animal that hadn't been classified or really discovered yet, that some evidence of them would have been found by now. Physical evidence, whether it's a skeletal remains or hair, even physical DNA. You think something would have been found at this point.
We even talked about that in our Yucca Man series, is that there was one incident of way back in the day when these two, I don't know if they were hunters or miners,
right,
but claimed to have shot one.
Right.
And they were supposed to bring it in for inspection.
Right.
And then all of a sudden that never happened. It was just gone.
Yeah, the thing, supposedly it disappeared. I mean, whether you believe the miners or not, that's up to you to decide, but they supposedly just disappeared.
But if you're a Bigfoot enthusiast who believes in the fact that they can just jump out of our reality and our dimension at will and jump into these portals,
right,
that would be very believable then if this, particular Bigfoot that was shot and killed, or Yucca Man, suddenly would disappear.
Especially if some people believe that they're protectors of some sort.
Exactly. And that, I did talk to somebody last night who talked about this, interdimensional aspect of it. And they live on a Native American reservation.
Wow, okay.
And they had a lot of stories to tell about this type of scenario. And one of the things that she relayed was that the elders of the tribe, being her grandfather, that they had said that they would do certain circle dances, and that the Bigfoot were actually kindred spirits with them.
Okay.
And that they were interdimensional, and that they would come to these circle dances.
That's really interesting, considering all the lore and the history of the Native American people. Describing their encounters with people they called the Sky People.
Right.
Which, a lot of people who hear these stories think that could be evidence of UFO encounters, even as far back as the days of the early Native Americans.
Right.
So it's interesting to hear that they're experiencing the phenomenon with Bigfoot, or, Sasquatch, in general, as being interdimensional.
Exactly. According to her elders, they can come and go as they please.
Right.
They were sort of watching over them, and that's why they would come to these circle dances.
Right.
So that idea of it is comforting.
Yeah.
If that's the case.
Right.
I don't think there's ever been any cases of Bigfoot entities or cryptids really, trying to outright harm people without being provoked.
No, it's usually when someone is chasing them that at least the description of the incident occurs when they're like trying to get footage, or they're even hunting him, and the Bigfoot defends himself.
Right.
I think if you were being pursued by someone and you're just trying to go about your business, you're going to be defensive too. Whether or not these incidents really occurred, again, is up to debate.
Right.
However, most cases are not very, violent or confrontational at all. It's glimpses.
Exactly.
And
so
that's the key thing right there is glimpses.
Glimpses.
As they're there, and then suddenly they're not.
Well, I guess then, if we relate it to the Hat Man,
right?
If the Hat Man were an interdimensional type of being,
yeah,
and a lot of people do relate that he simply stands there and watches.
Right.
Is he watching with evil intent, as some people believe?
Right.
Or is he watching to watch out for you for some reason? And if he isn't evil, is the idea of the fear just created by our own minds that we're seeing something that we're not comfortable with?
Yeah.
Especially standing there, not running away.
I mean, if you see someone in your room,
right,
or you're in your privacy of your own home, and there's just a tall man wearing a hat staring at you, I think fear is going to be the first thing you feel.
Of course. And we've talked about that in general in the paranormal investigation field per se.
Of course.
Where a lot of shows will, even their own investigators react with fear, that they're scared that they're hearing something or seeing something. And the thing is, if we're talking about these just being spirits, which are loved ones left behind, what is there to be so afraid of?
Of course. I mean,
it's just the unknown.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with this field, that's why we are doing this podcast, especially because we want people to be able to have more information and see this through a lens that isn't necessarily fear-based.
Exactly.
So I think as far as normal, typical ghost or spirit activity, there's nothing to really be afraid of. It's their energy. They're just there. They're existing. It doesn't mean that they can physically hurt you. And I think even cases where people report red marks or a scratch, I think the spirits are so desperate to be heard, for people to know that they're there, that they're reaching out, they're trying to get your attention, and then maybe they exert a little too much force in that moment, trying to get your attention, and they accidentally scratch you, or feel a mark on your arm forming. And it's not necessarily because they're evil and trying to hurt you or kill you. It's just that they're trying to get your attention.
I always try and envision if that were me, and on the other side, wherever that is.
Right.
And I can see people there, my loved ones especially, or whoever, and I'm trying to get their attention.
Right.
And they can't see me. How desperate would I be for communication?
Right.
I mean, would I be so desperate that I want to reach out to them and hold on to their arm, or like to just say, "Hey, I'm here."
Of course, yeah.
We can only assume how others feel, and that includes spirits. So I never try and look at things from a state of fear.
No.
But I think it is most people's natural reaction, and I get it. But where this is concerned, I don't think with the Hat Man we're ever going to have the answer as to what the Hat Man is.
No.
You can even go as far as to say, does he really exist?
Of course.
Is it a really fantastic urban legend born out of something else? Or is it sleep paralysis? Or is sleep paralysis and sleep disorders just a way that this can manifest?
To me, it's kind of like the concept of the Mandela effect, and I won't get into the Mandela effect. We'll talk about that another day. But it's the concept that, some people could, just have false memories or have seen something, but when you get, like, thousands and sometimes even millions of people reporting the same thing, the same experience, how do you just write that off?
Exactly.
Something's got to be occurring. To me, the interesting thing about the theory of the interdimensional thing is that a lot of people have actually reported the Men in Black are interdimensional as well. Mm-hmm. They're not necessarily, the U.S. government coming in doing an investigation in the secret. Sometimes there's a lot of people who say they will appear and then just disappear, kind of like the Hat Man and Sasquatch and all that. Which is interesting to me because there is a story that I read, just a quick one, but a girl woke up when she was a teenager speaking a language she had never spoken before.
Right.
And she saw the spirit of a little girl next to her. She was speaking to this little girl in this language that she had never spoken before or even heard of. And then she looked around the room and she was surrounded by these shadow figures. But in the corner was the Hat Man. And the interesting thing she noted about the Hat Man, aside from his appearance and being a larger presence overall, is that he seemed to be amused by the situation. As if he was kind of enjoying it more than everyone else around him. Like he knew something about why she was speaking this language and why these people were here. Almost as if he was observing or testing something. Now, the interesting thing about that is that there are a lot of theories about the Men in Black, not just kind of shutting down experiences, but almost as if they're testing something. Now, if you're an interdimensional being, or even a UFO, an alien, who is much more advanced, what do we do as humans to organic, beings who are not as intelligent as us? We tend to test, right?
Right.
Scientifically speaking, a lot of tests are done on animals and plants and organic beings that do not have the same level of intelligence as humans do.
Well, yeah, we do that in trying to find medication to treat diseases all the time.
Yeah, so if you're a higher being than even humans, what's to say they don't do the same thing? Now, the test may not be obvious to us, but what if the Hat Man was there observing something going on, and he was amused by the situation, and then this girl wakes up, and he's amused that she's experiencing these things. Now, does that mean he's evil? I don't know. I don't know if he's feeding off that negative energy, or is he drawn to negative energy already built up, and he's observing something?
Right.
That's the question.
That's a question, like all of these things, that we'll never have the answer to, but
No, but it's interesting.
it's interesting to explore all theories.
Yeah.
I don't think we can ever say we know one thing for sure, but the Hat Man is something that I think, since especially this documentary recently came out,
Right.
more and more people are coming forward with their stories. And I can just tell you, from last night to this morning, I have had literally hundreds of people comment and relay stories of their own experiences. So when something is that widespread, I don't think we can ignore it.
No, of course not. Even I saw shadow people when I was younger. The shadow people is something that's been occurring all the time, and for this many people to see a specific shadow entity, like Christina said, it kind of lends credence to the stories more than it does towards, simple mental health or physical health reasons. I think there's much more to it than that.
I agree. And we are reaching our hour point.
Right.
I'm sure we could talk about this more, but I wanted to end with one of the personal stories that someone was comfortable with me sharing today.
All right, cool.
And bear with my sore throat I'm fighting.
All right.
So this is from a person, and I am not going to give her name, and I'm just going to read what happened, and we'll start right here. Well, when we moved into our apartment, the guy we rented it from laughed and said, "It's different." Never even thought about that comment until later. The first night there, we both had horrible, crazy dreams. Then one night, I opened the bathroom door to go to the bathroom, and I saw a dark figure with a hat sitting at the table in between our room and the bathroom. I was frozen and then looked back at my husband, who was asleep, to scream. But when I turned back, the figure was gone. So on my way back to the bedroom, I had a dark shadow in front of me. All the lights were out, so I thought it was my husband getting out of bed to use the bathroom after me. Let's see. I put my arms around him to hug him, and I felt heat like static electricity. It wasn't my husband. It was the Shadow Man. He literally looked almost like the Marlboro Man, I would say, by the hat he was wearing. We moved out, and the next couple that moved in saw it too. I never told them about it, but she found me to ask me if I had had the same experience and to share her experience. I think about it all the time. And that is her story. And when it comes to the Marlboro Man reference.
Right.
That I saw that reference so many times in my research.
Right.
And when then she wrote that to me, I thought, wow, that is a very common thing with the cowboy hat reference. A lot of people would say that he looked like the old Marlboro Man ads.
Right.
So
that's so interesting. Mm-hmm. And the fact that she had a physical interaction with this.
And that was the first time I had read one like that, where it was an actual physical interaction.
And not attacking her, that she approached and was able to hug him thinking it's her husband.
Right.
And to even feel the heat, the energy coming off of him.
Well, that's what I found interesting. She said it felt like static electricity. And a lot of times when we talk about, the communication with energy that's left behind.
Right.
These, people or energy that is out there, who's to say that the Hat Man isn't just the manifestation of someone else's, loved one that has passed on? I mean, we don't know.
Right.
So I just found her account to be very interesting among the hundreds that I received. So we'll leave you with that one.
Yeah, that was a good one to end on. That was really interesting.
And if anyone has any personal stories that they want to share with us, our socials are always here at the bottom of each episode.
Yeah, direct message us, email us, what have you, and we'll either leave you anonymous or we'll show your story.
Exactly.
But if we don't share it here directly on the podcast, we can always share it on social media too.
Exactly.
On Instagram or Twitter, what have you. So feel free to hit us up.
Please do. And as always, keep listening. You have certain topics even that you want to suggest, direct message us, and we will be covering as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, please leave us a review and subscribe to our podcast. That always helps us.
And please share.
Yeah, please share it with your friends. And you guys have been really great lately. Our views are increasing, and we really appreciate your engagement. And I'm so glad you guys are enjoying this, because we love doing this every week.
That's what we look forward to. So, hopefully you won't see the Hat Man, but if you do,
right,
let us know, and we will talk to you again next week.
All right, everyone, thanks for listening, and keep looking, keep searching, and we'll talk to you guys next time.
Over and out.
Bye, everyone.